Welcome to Ideas of India, a podcast where we examine academic ideas that can propel India forward. My name is Shruti Rajagopalan, and we are kicking off the 2021 Job Market series, where I speak with young scholars entering the academic job market about their latest research on India. Our first scholar in this series is Arkadev Ghosh, who is a PhD candidate in economics at the University of British Columbia. He obtained his master's in economics at the London School of Economics and his bachelor's degree at the University of Edinburgh. We discuss his job market paper titled Religious Divisions and Production Technology: Experimental Evidence from India. We talked about his field experiment on worker productivity in religiously homogeneous versus mixed groups in both high dependency and low dependency tasks. We also talked about what this experiment reveals about Hindus and Muslims at the workplace, and his other research on political business cycles in conflict areas in India. For a full transcript of this conversation, including helpful links with all the references mentioned, click the link in the show notes or visit discoursemagazine.com. Hi, Arkadev. Thank you so much for coming on the show. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much for having me, Shruti.
I want to go straight to your job market paper. And this is a fascinating experiment that you've conducted in West Bengal, where you randomly assign Hindu and Muslim workers at a manufacturing plant to either a religiously homogeneous work group or a mixed religion work group. And you find that mixed teams are less productive than homogeneous teams, but only when it comes to a very high dependency task, right? You don't find that result for low dependency tasks. But at the same time, while there's this sort of negative impact on productivity when there are interreligious groups, that effect sort of fades away over a period of time and in a few months. So can you describe this experiment and sort of the mechanism at work here that you observe that leads to this kind of, sort of productivity shock and then it comes back to normal?
Absolutely. The broad motivation for this paper is really this recent evidence that ethnic diversity can lower private sector output. We know there's a larger literature looking at this in the public sector, looking at coordination failure amongst groups, but really there's been this recent evidence that due to poor social ties or taste-based discrimination, mixed groups of workers can perform worse in the private sector. And it's natural to think that maybe firms will react to these costs, right? Maybe they stay small to minimize interethnic interactions, or that as they grow, they may segregate workers, which would only perpetuate discrimination in these societies. But really, to fully understand these effects, we need to know two things. Basically, the long-run effects of contact in firms, which we don't have evidence on. Maybe things improve over time. And also, maybe we don't need to segregate workers. Maybe we just need the right technology as we grow. So that's exactly what my job market paper tries to answer. So I look at both the short and the long-run effects of intergroup contact in firms and see how these effects depend on the production technology. So like you summarized, I randomized workers into either mixed or religiously homogeneous teams and kept these teams intact for a period of 4 months. The key aspect of this is how the effects vary by the production technology or the production function. So, like you said, a high dependency work here. So just to elaborate a little bit more for the listeners, what a high dependency work is clearly a classic example would be work on a conveyor belt. Okay, so there's multiple workers standing and then each person is responsible for picking up every second or third piece of the product. So there's this instantaneous contact and coordination required with your teammates. And a low dependency task, in contrast, since this is a food manufacturing plant, so let me talk about a mixing room where, raw materials are mixed. So one worker is responsible for, just weighing the materials properly. The other worker is arranging the flour buckets where someone else is actually mixing it in a machine. So it's not like you don't need contact. You still need coordination, but, contact is more, loose in a way, if I may use that word, and it's more intermittent. But it's perfectly possible to undermine or sabotage your teammate in this setting as well. And sort of a core idea that differentiates, the core idea in economics that differentiates between HD and LD tasks is the degree of complementarity of labor inputs. It's a high degree of complementarity in HD. So I find key three things, like you said. I find that mixing reduces productivity, but this happens only in high dependency tasks. And consistent with this, I find that there's more frictions and lower team cohesion when I mix workers in high dependency tasks. So there's more accusations, intergroup blame, and, in general, lower team cohesion. And there are some frictions in LD tasks as well, but, the production technology is such that it sort of mediates these frictions and it doesn't affect output. And the second result, like you mentioned, is that, sort of despite these negative effects, over time, through repeated contact, they go away. And this is something that past studies haven't shown, typically because they don't look at the long run effects, or the institutional setting doesn't allow them to look at the long run effects of repeated contact. So that I find that, over time with repeated contact, these effects go away. And the third key thing that I find is that, and this for me is the most interesting part, is that despite these negative output shocks, intergroup relations improve from mixing in high dependency. Whereas in low dependency, while there is no sort of output shock, there is no improvements in productivity either over time. And this really suggests that there's this tension between the goals of maximizing productivity versus improving intergroup relations. So, contact that really forces people to learn to work together is important in reducing discrimination and prejudice, but it might be costly. And since, there are these frictions, and maybe you maybe dislike your teammate in a low dependency task, but there's no real cost to output. And maybe that's also why there's no incentive to try to overcome your differences. So that's the big picture takeaway from the paper.
One of the mechanisms at play here, or at least as you find initially, is that Hindus as a group have a very low priors regarding how hardworking their Muslim co-workers are, right? Relative to their within group Hindu co-workers. In contrast, Muslims don't make a similar, distinction between in-group Muslim co-workers versus Hindu co-workers. So what are some of the reasons these priors exist and are reinforced over a period of time, and how do they exactly break down through interaction in these high dependency tasks? So can you just walk us through that process?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So just to rationalize some of these core results that I told you, I develop a theoretical framework in the paper. It also helps me do is sort of differentiate between competing mechanisms. There could be multitude of explanations for what I just told you. And a fundamental assumption of the theory or the model in the paper is that Hindus start off with a lower prior about Muslim teammates, about their effort or how hardworking they are, whereas Muslims do not make this distinction. And at first glance, you may think that is sort of a weird assumption to make, but this is really based on the empirical fact that Muslims are always working with Hindus, whereas Hindus are not, just because of the distribution of Hindus and Muslims in the population. Okay, so there's this fundamental asymmetry in baseline contact that Hindus and Muslims have with non-co-religionists. I mean, of course, there's residential segregation. People go to different schools, but, in formal workplaces or factories, Hindus being the majority, they don't come in as much contact with Muslims as Muslims do with Hindus. So, and together with the general evidence of labor market discriminations against Muslims and the fact that they're tend to have lower education, I assume that Hindus start off with this lower prior, whereas Muslims, having always worked with Hindus, do not make this distinction. One of the key implications of this model is then the priors of Hindus would really matter. Okay, so whether they've had past contact or what they believe about Muslims would really determine the effect you have in mixed teams. So this is heterogeneity by priors of Hindus, whereas Muslims would be more forward-looking and trying to integrate in, knowing that they're discriminated against. They're sort of really used to this. And so I find evidence that is consistent with this mechanism. In the paper, I actually find that while Hindus are more likely to blame initially low output on their Muslim teammates, Muslims actually work harder than would be optimal, having this long-term view in order to sort of mitigate these negative effects. And that's essentially why we see this attenuation. And I think this general finding is applicable to many settings, even outside India. You can think of, there's work on how African Americans have to work twice as hard to achieve similar career goals. Women have to work twice as hard, or even Asian immigrants in the US, sort of how they try to achieve a model minority status as opposed to trying to culturally assimilate. So yeah, I think sort of this minority group initiating the integration process is applicable to many other settings, even outside this Hindu-Muslim context.
And what is interesting about what you find is that the prior is not very strong. It's a relatively weak prior, which can be overcome through this kind of initiation, through the minority group. And it can be overcome sometimes in as little time as 4 months, right? I know 4 months is a fairly long period of time in a production cycle at a food manufacturing firm, but it's a very, very short period of time when we're talking about weakening of, long-term held views and biases, right?
Absolutely. And this gives me a lot of hope. If you can convince firms or even think of policies or subsidies for firms that have HD production functions, that would really sort of help integrate workers in these kind of settings. Because, and as I was mentioning you briefly, there's really this tension, right? As a firm, if there's output loss from mixing workers, even if it's for 10 days, I have no incentive to do that. Whereas if there's really these positive effects that we are finding of mixing in these groups where there can be negative effects on output initially, maybe there's clearly a case for government intervention or subsidies to these firms in order to incentivize them to integrate in these settings.
On the other hand, I would say even for the firms, there might be an incentive in the longer run because segregation of workers works out great when everything is normal. But the moment there are conflicts, actually segregated workers lead to more violence and worse tensions and worse outcomes, right? For the long-term productive health of a firm, it's actually better to spend, the money in the short run to integrate and have mixed teams and have that kind of social cohesion within the firm then risk some of the terrible consequences that come from long-term segregation, right?
I couldn't agree more with you. I mean, this is a very, very key point. And, to really understand this better, I actually went ahead and surveyed more than 100 supervisors at different firms after my project. Part of this was to assess the external validity of my results, whether they can predict the results, and also to, get recommendations for policy implications. And one of the things that I asked them was, if you see these negative effects on output, would you segregate workers? And a fair share seem to understand that these effects go away over time. Sort of they internalize this fact and they say no, but the first order concern that the people have was like you just said, it's impossible to segregate workers. We just cannot do that. That will actually raise tensions. I mean, think of a line with only Muslims. We don't do that. That's just an impossible sort of HR policy to implement. So yeah, it's always in the interest of the firm to have workers integrated, especially because of the political sort of instability in these areas, right?
So, one interesting thing that I learned from reading your paper is that some of the work that you did, you made these observations during the CAA protests and, in the backdrop of the riots that broke out, right? And you find that the backdrop of riots, even though it's not happening within the firm, it still impacts the productivity of tasks, especially in low dependency tasks, which previously were not that affected by the kinds of, intergroup mingling that you were talking about. So what is the mechanism at play there? These are tasks where it's harder to sabotage your co-workers, but in the midst of tensions outside of the firm, there is almost a greater incentive to sabotage workers. Did I interpret that result correctly?
Right. I look at two different events. So there was the riots in New Delhi, but there was a fair bit of violence also broke out in West Bengal, and especially in the district where the factory is located. So I used both of these events. So what I find is that during these period of heightened tensions, there were negative effects in low dependency as well. And this is important for two reasons. Firstly, it shows that the production technology is important. If things can go wrong, and these are actually teams as well in low dependency, but we see that only during this heightened period of tension. So it really tells you that if you wanted to sabotage or undermine the efforts of teammates, or this strong dislike or distaste towards your teammate, you really take actions that otherwise you wouldn't. So, people don't come into the firm thinking of, I'll definitely want to sabotage or undermine my outgroup member. That's not the mentality I saw, generally amongst workers as well. The political discourse or these extreme events can make them do that. And that's also why generally, I sort of gravitate towards this mechanism about priors rather than this sort of strong distaste against outgroup workers. Because if that were the case, we should always see these effects in LD, like you said, and we do not do that. That just means that, workers are really not trying to always sabotage you. They're sort of not coming in with that mentality.
How generalizable are some of these results outside of the specific factory or even outside of, some of these districts and neighboring districts in West Bengal? The reason I ask is that the priors about other religious groups and the interaction with other religious groups and interreligious tensions, they are so specific to location, to urban versus rural setting, even specific blocks and neighborhoods in urban settings. So how do you think about generalizing some of your findings from this particular factory firm to other kinds of settings beyond food manufacturing and beyond this district?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think this is a general and fair criticism of, works that look at, in a very specific setting. And generalizability is, of course, important. So what I can tell you about this project is in terms of the theory and in terms of the sample of workers, and especially in terms of the theory, I don't make any assumptions. The priors that I assume about Hindus and Muslims are super location specific. And, the asymmetry that I assume that, Hindus do not have enough contact with Muslims, whereas Muslims do, is also true for most of India. And maybe even starker because, the proportion of Muslims in West Bengal is actually higher than the average across India. In terms of the results and the representativeness of the firm, what I actually do is I also study firms in and around my partner firm. So I look at their hiring policies, the religious composition of the staff in these other factories in the area. And I argue in the paper that my partner firm is representative of the average factory in the district where I worked. And furthermore, as I was briefly alluding to you before, to really see the generalizability of my results, whether, people outside this firm can even predict these results. I actually surveyed more than 100 production supervisors across multiple different firms in West Bengal. And, I was fairly surprised to see that not everyone, but a fair share of workers could actually predict these results. That, religious divisions being more costly in high dependency versus low dependency. So, this gives me more confidence that, I'm not looking at something that's super specific only to this firm. And in terms of this literature, if you look at, the first paper that comes to my mind is by Jonas, an Acacia flower plant, and he finds similar effects, and he only finds negative effects. And from then on, there have been a few papers looking at very different contexts, but looking at generally low-skill jobs with ethnic diversity. And they've also found these effects, of course, in different contexts, different mechanisms. But I think sort of what this tells you is we need this kind of setting to look at these studies, but at least this effect of religious divisions in the private sector is becoming fairly generalizable, even though we need the specific sort of setting to look at it.
So, there's some work also done on caste composition, compared to religious composition as you are studying. There's, of course, work by, Afridi, Dillon and Sharma, which is in garment factories. There's Matt Lowe's now famous paper on cricket leagues with, intercaste composition. What do you see as the similarity and differences between interreligious mixed groups versus caste groups?
Right. That's an important question. And I do look at the effects of caste as well. I mean, that's not my unit of randomization, or that's not the main question I'm looking at in this paper. But, you get some natural variation in the caste composition of teams from randomization. And actually, I don't find much going on, whether it be, just homogeneous teams with different castes, or the interaction of Hindus who are with Muslims, whether they're high caste or low caste. And I sort of went in with this prior because in contrast to, Farzana Afridi and co-author setting and even Matt's setting, caste divisions are not super salient, at least in the workplace in West Bengal. I mean, of course, it matters for residential segregation in marriage markets. They are important, but at least in a factory of workers, I do not find that to be a super important division. But the local politics is now changing, so you never know. Maybe it would be interesting to look at in the future. But yeah, the short answer is I looked at it, but I do not find any effects.
How much do you think some of this changes when you study a factory floor versus, say, a sports team or a league? I ask because, when you're looking at a sports team and intermingling, a win or a loss is a joint win or a joint loss, right? Unlike a factory floor where your wages are your own and evaluations for your promotions and so on are your own. You're not the owner or the residual claimant, right? So how does that change how we think about these kind of mixed groups in work setting versus non-work settings like sports?
That's a great question. I think even in the work setting, these are still teams. So while, promotions would determine your individual effort, there's still sort of complementarities and teamwork. You have a set of common goals that you need to work towards, even at the workplace. So I think it's similar in that setting. Now, an important question is, this difference in contact inside the firm versus outside the firm. So can I make sports teams with these workers outside and have the similar effects in the firm? And that would be super interesting to find, particularly because I find this tension, right? Because you have to bear this cost to integrate, but maybe if you can play sports with these workers and have similar effects, maybe you can sort of avoid those types of costs. But that's not to say that, organizing a cricket tournament or a soccer tournament with factory workers is not expensive. That itself is expensive. That also costs you productivity. But I think what is key is whether it's just pure dislike and distaste for your teammate, which can be overcome through sports, versus whether it's really beliefs about productivity. And if it's really beliefs about productivity, then the contact outside the firm might not be useful. And my model suggests that it is beliefs about productivity. But I think that's a super interesting direction for a future study. And I think I've talked to Matt about this. So we maybe plan to do something like this together.
Do you at all worry about some of the ethical issues at play when it comes to this sort of, field experiments where you're randomizing and placing individuals and you don't intend to, but you could possibly be exposing them to physical or mental harm because of discrimination on a factory floor, or sometimes it's abuse, sometimes it's violence. So how do we square these concerns as social scientists while relying on field experiments that can potentially provide a lot of insight?
Yeah, I mean, I take this issue very seriously, but of course, I'm not an expert on this. And, the project, of course, went through a rigorous ethics process before I actually implemented it. But I think the field gradually is moving towards, making this ethics process more transparent, be open about it. And I think that's a great thing. Rather than just an ethics review board looking at, authors like Dean Carlin and Christopher Rudry have suggested that papers now have a structured ethics appendix. So you really talk about the potential harm to participants, the conflicts of interest, the misuse of resources, research results, typically the things you would have to submit to an ethics board before you get the approval for the study. So we can have general consensus building on what is acceptable and what is not. So I think that's a great direction that we're moving towards. What I can tell you personally for this experiment is I tried to be as less intrusive as possible. So I did not change anything for the workers that would fall outside the purview of their work contract. I did not make them work more or less. There was no changes to payments, no changes to timing of shifts or any of those things. And even the teams that I formed, either mixed teams or Hindu-only teams, that's the naturally occurring sort of team structures at baseline. Again, there's very few Muslim-only teams because there are very few Muslims. And I didn't also want to change that structure because you might be worried that, you suddenly have different structures of team that are formed at baseline than in the experiment. So I also made sure that I do not do that. So overall, there was this one-time change to these teams, keeping everything else about their work condition constant. And this is something they agree to in the work contract.
I think the relevant thing, right, that the workers themselves agree that they might be placed in an individual team or a mixed group team. So the only level of loss of control is that they are being randomized by an external entity as opposed to choosing themselves to go into one mixed group versus a homogeneous group.
Yeah. And in the context of this firm, actually, their contract asked them to submit in the contract that they couldn't be put in any team according to the requirements of the firm. So that's something that is not unusual or a big change that I made in terms of something that they're not used to at all.
Do these firms have, just out of curiosity, some kind of redressal mechanism when these kinds of tensions might crop up or when there might be a lot of discrimination faced on the, factory shop floor? India has not gotten quite there yet.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, in general, I think the part of what they try to do is they are aware that, there's these external tensions that can happen and that sort of have these effects internally. And one of the facts is that they try to integrate workers, or rather, I'd say they try not to separate workers. Apart from that, I don't think there's sort of organized redressal mechanisms that take place rather than those naturally occurring amongst people. So I think there's scope for that kind of interventions too, absolutely.
I want to switch gears a little bit and talk to you about some of the other research that you've been working on, which is also very fascinating. This is your work on political business cycles in India, especially in mining areas where there's a lot of Naxal activity. So can you tell me a little bit more about that paper?
Absolutely. I studied this paper, which looks at electoral cycles in mineral extraction, so several different proxies of mineral extraction. And, there's a large literature that dates back to the 70s, which looks at electoral cycles in economic activity. I mean, the first models were developed by William Nordhaus and Lindbeck, who essentially argued that opportunistic politicians would stimulate the economy and increase employment right before elections, and the inflationary effects would be felt, after. So myopic voters would not be able to see that. And since then, the literature has moved to more sort of young and nascent democracies, looking at general infrastructure spending, rural credit expansion, health infrastructure, health spending, etc. And typically, the finding is that there is this increase in economic activity or economic spending before elections, which then again falls. With respect to mining, what I find is that exactly the opposite pattern. So whether you look at mineral extraction, so just output, or licensing, or even accidents and deaths in the fields, which is an important sort of aspect of this economic activity, I find that this is inverted U-shaped pattern in the sense that after an election, it really goes up. And then as, sort of this election cycle ends, the next set of elections, they go down again. So yeah, that's the stark pattern. And, there's basically two things that I find. One is that, really the electoral competition matters. So if as a politician, I'm sitting on a smaller victory margin, my cycle shape is even larger. So I reallocate more mining to earlier years in my term, and I really, really do a sharper sort of drop as we approach the next election. And also the conflict matters. So the Naxalite conflict or the intensity of Naxalite conflict in the district is an important determinant of the shape of these cycles. So if it's a Naxal affected district, again, the shape is more stark in that it goes up more after elections and comes down starkly before elections.
Yeah, I had a follow-up question about the conflict in particular. There is some work on political business cycles in India. There's the work by Sukantar on sugar canes in Maharashtra, or the work by Kapoor and Vaishnav on cement and builder connections. So what they find is sort of, pretty standard, which is there is a decrease in activity because the funds are basically being diverted to the political activity, right? Mm-hmm. Now, those are not in conflict areas. Whereas now there's an additional question of not only is this a conflict area, but a very large part of the Naxal conflict is to stop the smooth functioning of elections, right? So how does that interact with the political business cycle when it comes to mining?
Right. No, that's an important question. And you're right. Like this paper by Kapoor and Vaishnav on with respect to cement, what they find is that, yeah, you're right, that they have to allocate funds to politicians, and that's why they face a liquidity crunch, and that sort of output goes down. So with respect to the conflict, I mean, it's established that Naxals want to stop the smooth function of elections. And it's also established in previous work that, mining forms a large resource or economic base. Extortion of mining revenues forms a large economic base for the Naxalites. So what I show is that, this reduction in mining leading up to an election is strategic in that it's a way to reduce this resource base for the Naxalites. So in that sense that, that could affect their funding, and that would in turn affect the level of violence. So I compare mining districts to non-mining districts, and, non-mining districts, the funding base of the Maoists are very different. It's mostly small traders or businessmen that they extort from. And I don't find that, and politicians have less leverage over these, sort of more disaggregated funding bases, right? So I do not find a fall in violence in these areas, typically because politicians have less leverage over these funding sources of the Maoists, whereas mining is something which, Sam Asher and Paul Novosad in a recent paper have shown that it has a large involvement of politicians. So I argue that because of their large-scale involvement in this industry, they're actually able to manipulate activity in a way that sort of suits their electoral agenda, in that they try to reduce violence by minimizing the rebel group's resource base.
So actually, it's a weird political business cycle which may actually enhance the smooth functioning of elections.
Yeah.
Right? While simultaneously
right.
dealing with the conflict that may not be the intended effect, but it's certainly a byproduct.
Actually, yeah. So the propensity of conflict and economic activity increases there. We might, see this sort of a pattern, yes.
What have you been up to during the pandemic?
Oh, yeah. The start of the pandemic was very stressful because I had to move my endline survey basically online. The pandemic struck in the middle of my sort of job market paper experiment. But yeah, I've just been watching a lot of shows since then, being at home. And I really like Ted Lasso, which I've been recently watching.
Oh, yeah. I am obsessed with Ted Lasso right now. I'm waiting
it's amazing, right?
Yeah, I've completely caught up, which is rare for me. So I'm kind of now waiting for the next episodes to come out as they release.
Right, yeah. Every Friday, I'm just waiting for the next episode.
What else have you been binge watching?
What else? Just been watching some movies that come up. And in terms of shows, I think I was just watching Manifest, which was a little sort of dark. Yeah, I enjoyed it.
Yeah, Ted Lasso is perfect pandemic watching, right? It just kind of puts a smile on your face.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for doing this, Arkadev. This was such a pleasure.
Thank you very much for having me, Shruti. It was a wonderful experience.
Thanks for listening to Ideas of India. If you enjoy this podcast, please help us grow by sharing with like-minded friends. You can connect with me on Twitter at @srajagopalan. In the coming weeks, we will feature weekly short episodes with young scholars entering the academic job market discussing their latest research on India. Also, check out our new initiative commemorating 30 years of India's market reforms at the 1991project.com. The 1991 Project is an effort to revive the discourse on growth-centered economic reforms in India by focusing on the economic ideas that drove them. In the coming months, we will publish essays, data visualizations, oral histories, podcasts, and policy papers demystifying the Indian economy and the 91 reforms. You can see all the content and subscribe to our newsletter for updates at the 1991project.com.